The following video contains spoilers for Crimson Peak, Infinity War, Doctor Who, Return of the Jedi, A New Hope, Mad Max Fury Road, Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2, Stranger Things, War for the Planet of the Apes, Avatar The Last Airbender, Game of Thrones, Infinity Train, She-Ra and the Princesses of Power, and Dante's Peak. For some reason. Some people are just never appreciated in their own lifetime. Hello folks, today we're going to go over some tropes, specifically one trope, the death equals redemption trope. I don't have any particular impetus for talking about this, other than having wanted to tackle it for a little while and realizing that if I don't jump on it, Overly Sarcastic Productions will cover it in a trope talk and probably make every point I'm about to and also do it better than me. Professional jealousy is a hell of a motivator sometimes, but let us get right into this. So, what is this trope? Well, it's when a villainous or severely morally compromised character does a heel-face turn and assists the good guys in some way. Maybe they try to sabotage an evil plan that's already in motion. Maybe they're a minion who attacks the big bad evil guy outright. Maybe they jump in front of a bullet meant for the heroes. Their reasons for this can vary actually quite wildly. Everything from realizing the scope of the damage of what they're doing for really the first time, finally admitting to themselves just how far gone their evil boss really is, or maybe they've got some reason to be soft on the heroes. But the important part of the trope is that through this positive act, the character dies, either immediately or soon after as a direct result of their actions. Don't worry, we're going to get into plenty of examples of this as we go along. First, let's talk about why this is even a trope in the first place, because there are reasons these ideas get used so often. So, there's a few factors on why a writer, director, creator, whoever, might decide to redeem a character through death. Firstly, the writer might feel that for the crimes the character committed up to this point, there's just no other way to even attempt redemption. They've done too much damage to be let off the hook and allowed to live. So you establish that there is some good in them and then kill them off in the same stroke, so it still feels like justice was done. In a more long-form story like a TV series or an ongoing novel series, the writers may not want to figure out how to integrate a redeemed villain into the hero party, or otherwise just don't feel like using them once they've changed sides. This one actually kind of points to the bluntest reason why this trope gets used. The redeemed character has lost a lot of their narrative purpose at this point. You see, if a character's role in the story is largely building up to the point that they change sides, then the instant they do that, their personal arc is complete. And anyone who either doesn't have an arc or has a completed arc is, frankly, easier to kill off because the audience won't be left feeling like they died before their story was done. So since their arc is finished anyway, there's no harm in just clearing them off the board at the same time. Now, to be clear, this trope by no means says that death is required for redemption, and as noted, it usually has a lot to do with the severity of the previous offenses. In Return of the Jedi, Darth Vader's redemption is to save his son and die in the process because he's Darth freaking Vader, and even before the prequels came along and revealed him to be a child killer, he's just done too much. He's too much of a bad guy to be allowed to live. But, just as a point of comparison, in the original Star Wars film, A New Hope, Han Solo is also redeemed. But he's redeemed through something as minor as just helping out during the Death Star trench run. That's because Han isn't a fundamentally bad guy. He's a selfish guy. He's certainly a bit morally grayer than Luke or Leia. But his supposed offenses are minor, so he doesn't need to do as much to be redeemed. It's not necessary to kill him. So with the basics covered, let's dig into how this actually plays out in practice. Now, from my way of looking at this, it comes in three main flavors. The first is the character does the right thing and switches sides, but doesn't realize that what they're about to do is going to cost them their life. Think Thomas Sharp in Crimson Peak. All he's trying to do is stop the cycle of killing that he and his sister lover have been in for years, and he clearly doesn't realize that this break is going to drive Lucille to stab him directly in the face. Ugh. Sticking with Tom Hiddleston, Loki's death in Infinity War also fits this, even though he'd kind of been redeemed prior to this. But the reason it fits is because he clearly thought that he had the drop on Thanos, and he was just wrong about that. He didn't think he was going to die. Missy in Doctor Who is another good example, though a little grayer, because it's possible that she knew that going to help the Doctor would get her killed, timey-wiminess and all that, but there's also no real direct evidence that she thought this would happen. She doesn't seem surprised when it does, but she does the right thing and unwittingly sets off her own death. That's option one. On the other side of the spectrum, there's the willing sacrifice, where the character in question is fully aware that what they're about to do is going to get them killed, and they do it anyway. This is an easy way to really jack up the power of the heel face term, because it's not just doing the right thing. It's doing the right thing and willingly paying the ultimate price. And this one shows up all over the place. From Nux in Mad Max Fury Road, to Doc Ock in Spider-Man 2, to Billy in Stranger Things Season 3, they all knew that they were going to do something that they wouldn't survive, and they did it anyway. Now, a willing sacrifice doesn't necessarily require a character to have been fully and truly awful. Yondu in Guardians of the Galaxy isn't a good guy, but he's far from the worst, so why does he have to die to be redeemed? Well, in his case, it's because his primary motivators up to this point have all been self-serving. So the extreme opposite of that is to have him do what appears to be the most selfless thing possible. Knowingly die so someone else can live. Along those same lines is the grandmother from Dante's Peak. And yes, I know nobody younger than me remembers this movie at all. But once I realized that this actually fit, I couldn't get it out of my head. So we're just going to go through it super quick. Dante's Peak is a volcano disaster movie, and in it there's this stubborn old woman who refuses to leave her house despite it being in the danger zone. Highway to the danger zone. So our heroes go up to try and retrieve her, and ultimately they all end up in this boat on a lake trying to get away, but the lake has turned acidic from the volcanic activity, which is actually a real thing. Which is kind of crazy. But now the acid water is eating through the boat and the motor's dead. So Ruth, that's the grandmother, isn't some kind of murderer or deeply terrible person, and she certainly hasn't committed some kind of crime that she needs to die in order to atone for. But her selfish stubbornness is the reason any of them are in this situation at all, so it's still a redemption when she jumps into the water and pulls the boat to shore and then dies from her burns. Now, kind of splitting the difference between I didn't think this would get me killed and I totally know this is going to get me killed is what I tend to think of as the hyper-focus heroic turn. This is where it's actually not entirely clear if the character knows this will get them killed, because clearly in the moment, they're just focused on doing the good thing and may well not have had the time to think through the possible consequences, or maybe they've accepted it as a possibility, just not a certainty. A character like Red from War for the Planet of the Apes fits this mold. Arguably, Darth Vader does as well, though he might also be a willing sacrifice since he does seem to take time to consider what he's doing, but in the end, all we have is an expressionless mask, so it's actually pretty interpretable for the audience to decide if he thought this was going to get him killed or not. Now, this is the part where I'm going to have to show my hand a little bit and say that I personally am not the biggest fan of this trope. Now, like any trope, there are certain instances that work. It wouldn't have been prevalent enough to really become a staple of storytelling if there weren't instances that worked. But I've got a few reasons for not liking this. Firstly, I think it's kind of the easy route. That's not my only issue. We'll get to the other one later. But killing off a character makes things a lot easier and just a lot cleaner for the storyteller because, well, it's one less thing for them to have to worry about. Actually, it's a lot less things to have to worry about. If you're keeping around a reformed villain, there is a lot of stuff you're going to have to account for. You have to figure out if the heroes are going to be able to accept them and forgive them, if the character is likely to relapse into their villainy, what will it take for the audience to believe the change of heart is something that's actually going to stick. There's a lot to keep on top of. By contrast, if you kill the character off, the audience only has to buy that one instance of good behavior. Keep them around, and the question of, but are they really a good guy now, is going to keep popping up every single time they're around. And managing that is a lot more work. But there's also sometimes a more practical matter. You may have noticed that nearly all the examples I've cited so far have been from movies and barely anything from TV. And that's because redeeming a character by means other than death isn't just more work, it takes more time. And to be blunt about it, movies don't usually have the time to do this. These kinds of heel-face turns usually happen in or around the climax, so like the last 20 minutes of a 2-hour movie. And after that, there's not going to be enough time to assure the audience of the legitimacy of that redemption. So, death is the obvious solution, since it means it's basically a closed question. Even if audience is a little bit divided on whether they buy that this is fully redeeming or not, it's at this point just an academic debate because it doesn't impact the actual story while everything's getting wrapped up because the character in question isn't around anymore. That's not to say that there aren't redemption stories in movies that do take their time, but the thing is, those are generally redemptions for morally compromised heroes, not villains. So you can take something like The Unforgiven or In Bruges. These are definitely redemption stories, but the things the characters are trying to redeem themselves for are a background feature. It's something that happened in the past, and if it's shown at all, it's in a flashback, so that the focus can be on the redemption for the bulk of the movie. Again, taking the time needed. But that's why this is a treatment generally afforded to heroes or anti-heroes. You have to go to long-form formats like TV, and that is where you get stories that put in the work to redeem actual villains through means other than death. We're talking about characters like Prince Zuko from Avatar: The Last Airbender, who undergoes a super slow redemption over the course of the latter 2 seasons of the show. A big chunk of Stranger Things Seasons 2 is spent reinventing Steve Harrington, the generic high school jerk from the first season. The 3rd season of Infinity Train is largely a slow process of self-realization and then redemption for the character of Grace. Jaime Lannister is a hell of a redemption arc in Game of Thrones. Up until that last season anyway, but like that thing did everybody dirty. But my own personal favorite here is Catra from She-Ra and the Princesses of Power. Catra was a wonderfully complex villain working for the big bad, but driven by her own personal agenda and massive amounts of baggage and trauma. Now, in the 3rd season, she went so far as to try and end the goddamn world just despite her best frenemy and future love interest, Adora. Now, by the end of season 4, it was clear that Catra was reeling from everything that had gone on up to that point, but she couldn't seem to break from her most destructive behavior.
It's you. You drive them away, Wildcat.
And prior to the release of season 5, the last season of the show, I was incredibly nervous. I actually made a whole video at the time expressing my suspicion that the show was going to try and redeem Catra and ultimately pair her off with Adora, and I had a lot of apprehension about that idea. Because since I, like most people watching it, suspected the two were going to end up together at the end, I figured redemption through death was off the table, which, I mean, it's good because I don't like that anyway, but I just couldn't see how the show was going to be able to have that kind of ending for a character this dangerous and this toxic who'd done this much damage to virtually everybody around her. Well, the show writers are clearly smarter than me because they did make it work. 3 episodes into the 5th season, Catra tries to actually do the heroic sacrifice.
I want to do that one good thing in my life.
She betrays Horde Prime to help Glimmer escape his ship, and she's clearly shocked when 2 episodes later, Adora and company show up to rescue her. Catra tried to take the easy way out, do one good thing, and then be gone. But neither the show nor the characters were going to let it go down like that. And her entire arc for the next 8 episodes is about her working actively on getting better. And it's really well done because it includes brief relapses in behavior and Catra's growing self-awareness of her own issues and open acknowledgement that getting better about them is going to take time and be a long-term process.
I'm sorry. I got angry. It's something I'm working on.
Oh, you are?
Yes! Now can you please? Yes, I am.
It doesn't cheap out and pretend that the attempted sacrifice thing means, oh, she's good now. No, she's got a lot of work to do and has to want to do it, and the show gets that. It gets it with Catra. Anyway, unfortunately, given that I'm talking about redemption in general, I would kind of be remiss not to acknowledge that the show drops the ball with Hordak, who doesn't really look like he's gonna face justice for anything he does.
So are we all just okay with this?
Quick side tangent about that whole thing. The fact that Hordak getting let off the hook ended up rubbing so many people the wrong way kind of illustrates what a fine line Return of the Jedi was able to walk, because part of the reason that one works is that it's focused on redeeming Vader in the eyes of Luke and Luke alone. Luke is the reason he turns. Luke is the only one who witnesses it. Luke was really the only one invested in Vader's redemption at all. So, showing Vader redeemed in his son's eyes is what was needed. But the Hordak thing shows what would happen if Vader had lived, because She-Ra tried to redeem Hordak through Entrapta and also have him live, but literally nobody else has a reason to want redemption for Hordak, plus Entrapta doesn't have the same moral compass as the rest of the group anyway, so it's just weird, like in a bad way. Now, I mentioned earlier that I had another reason for not liking redemption equals death, other than just feeling that it's the cheap and easy way out. And this one is going to get a bit more philosophical and dig into more moral societal standards and expectations. Before I get into this, I don't think that anything I'm about to talk about is the intended message of redemption through death stories. I always say that you don't have to do it on purpose, because the pattern is the problem, and the patterns in stories and the things that repeat can cause some troubling framing for how we view and think about things. So my gut level problem with redemption through death is that it creates a scenario where someone who has done awful things can be redeemed through one good act of sufficient size. In narrative, it's a single act because, well, they're dead now, so they can't do anything else after that anyway. But extrapolating from that to real-world application, I have major issues with this very concept because, you know, most people aren't going to be part of a plan that will open a hell portal to a demon dimension, but we all do things that hurt other people at some points in our lives. And the perpetuation of redemption through death paints a world where your sins can be forgiven by a counterbalancing act. It makes morals a transactional thing, where a bad thing can be paid for by a good thing. Coming back to earlier where I said a common reason for this trope is because the bad things that the characters did were so bad, they can't be repaid any other way. And don't get me wrong, I'm not saying you shouldn't try to correct damage or that people aren't deserving of a second chance or whatever, but you have to go into doing that knowing that you are not owed forgiveness. And you have to do it because it's the right thing to do, not because you think it'll wipe your slate clean. My big problem with this transactional moral framework is that the people it empowers are the people who are doing the damage. It creates a situation where somebody who's hurt you says sorry or brings flowers or whatever and is expected to just think everything's fine. The debt's been paid. It's transactional. And it also pressures the person who was hurt or wronged to forgive them. How many times have you found yourself in a situation where you feel pressure to forgive someone who you just can't, even if it's just not right now? Maybe you're feeling direct pressure from that person or other people around you, or maybe just the general societal pressure because, well, they did a nice thing to make up for it, so it's supposed to be okay now. This is essentially the same core problem that I have with the whole idea of, well, you have to forgive family because they're family, because it puts the burden on the injured to forgive and perpetuates the idea that forgiveness is owed, and it's not. It's earned, and only the people who were hurt can decide whether redemption has been achieved or is even possible. It is not up to the person who did the damage, and it's definitely not up to an outside observer. And it gets worse because if morality is treated as being transactional, that doesn't actually encourage people to be good. Instead, it says that it's perfectly fine to be bad as long as you balance it out later. It says that it's okay to break things as long as you donate enough glue later on. I'm going to circle back to She-Ra one more time, talk about the death of Shadow Weaver. If you haven't seen the show, she's a bit of a wild card villain, one who has her own agenda and goals. She started out in the employ of Hordak, but split when it didn't suit her purposes anymore, and she's just the absolute worst. She's a monster who continually emotionally abused or manipulated Adora and Catra throughout their entire lives. And in the final episode, she goes to save Catra, the person she's abused more than any other, and of course, dies in the process. On first viewing, this annoyed the hell out of me because I thought the show tried to redeem one of the most deplorable villains through a heroic sacrifice. But on rewatch, that's not actually what's going on. Yes, Catra tells her not to do it. Yes, both she and Adora cry, but I mean, it's their mother figure, so awful as she was, this is going to stir up emotions. But the framing here is really important because Shadow Weaver clearly intends this to be her redemption. She makes a big show of it, even takes her mask off for the first time in the entire show. In her mind, this is her big hero moment where all is forgiven. Hell, she actually says, "You're welcome." Bitch, nobody said thank you. But what makes it clear to me that the makers of the show understood that she was not actually redeemed was that after this, when Adora and Catra move forward, the camera pans back down to Shadow Weaver's mask. Firstly, visually, the show is reminding us of the face of the monster, not the face she showed us at the very end, once, in order to gain sympathy. And, to cap it all off, the music in that moment isn't triumphant, it isn't even mournful. It's this. Yeah, they understood that she was not redeemed by that act, even though she clearly thought she was. So more than anything for me, the thing that really rubs me the wrong way about redemption through death is the subtextual message about morality that the trope sends. The message that it's possible to be redeemed by a single big act instead of putting in the long-term work to actively be better, regardless of whether or not the people you wronged actually forgive you. Real-life redemption has to be about being better in and of itself, not balancing out some kind of moral ledger. As I said, I suspect that these are unintended messages in nearly all cases, but they're there nonetheless. While it is possible to make redemption through death work, more often than not, I find it to be the easy way out for both the character and the writer, and if not handled very carefully, it risks reinforcing some, frankly, harmful ideas about morality. This sort of thing is why trope dissection and discussion is important. And even if you think I've got my head completely spun around the wrong way on this whole idea, I hope that you'll take the time to at least think about the tropes and others like it and examine it rather than just make use of it as is or assume it's fine because everyone does it. Because blind recycling perpetuates the status quo, and doing the work is what matters, even if your conclusion does not match mine. In any case, thank you very much for listening. I have a Patreon, and that is how I am able to pay my bills and keep this entire operation up and running. Even if you are not able to support me there, there's YouTube memberships. But regardless, I want to hear from you. Whatever your thoughts are on what I've been talking about, drop something down in the comments and let's talk about it. The like, share, subscribe help me battle back the algorithm, the Lovecraftian beast that it is. But I'm not going to put that much pressure on you. I'm not owed that kind of assistance. It's greatly appreciated. But at the end of the day, you are the council. I'm just running the meetings. And until next time, this council is adjourned. And look at you, sticking around through the credits. I appreciate that. Well, you know what? You're about to be treated to a whole ton of names going by on the screen, but there's a few of them that I want to give special attention to. My special thanks to Bookworm, Jared Boyce, MJ, Tracy Scrabbit, Vincent Paul Bartolucci, Kaylin Schwartz, Edelin, Hannah Acker, Robin Moore, Ross Schultz, and Shay Lagurle. If you want to hear me mispronounce your name, check out the reward tiers on the Patreon. But for right now, thanks so much.